Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here. It's really great to see so many faces that I haven't actually seen in 3 dimensions in a long time. So I'm very excited to be here and to see all of you and to have what I hope will be a really great session this afternoon. So I am Jonathan Knopf. I am a co-director for HousingForward Virginia along with Erica Sims, and we have a great staff team also here floating around. And we have lots of really great board members here in attendance too that will be participating in these panels. So we are out in force and we're happy to be here. So our discussion today is one in a series of our xChats, which we started the other year to try to have some more innovative ways of talking about our housing issues and our housing needs and challenges and opportunities in the Commonwealth. So today, we will be talking about where COVID has taken us. It's taken us in a lot of different directions, a lot that makes sense and a lot that may be surprising. But regardless, I think we all agree that we have some ailments right now in our housing world. We have a lot of people who need help. Obviously, that was the case before COVID. It remains the case today and will be the case tomorrow. But we have some more things in our medicine chest than we used to. This may be a really great thing. It may actually be a challenge for us. That's something that I think we will try to dissect today. But it's really tough to begin a conversation like this. Where do you even start to think about where the last 18 months, 2 years have taken us? This has been a really crazy journey, and we're in a place that nobody would have expected a couple of years ago. So today what we're going to do is try to break up this big topic into 4 different small panels, the first of which are really great, and they've already up there. They really appreciate the logistics of this event and are ready to talk to all of you. But we're going to break this into 4 panels. The first will focus on how we talk about housing during COVID, how that has changed, how that messaging has evolved over time, and how are we telling the story today, and are things working, and how should we tell the story in the future? The second thing that we'll talk about is capacity building. A lot of you in nonprofit organizations have dealt with a lot over the past few years, things that you probably never would have imagined. And so the capacity of our organizations across the Commonwealth to do the great work that you do has been challenged. But there's also lots of opportunities too. So we're going to talk about how these different organizations that do the on-the-ground work have evolved over COVID and what opportunities they may see coming up. Then we'll talk about collaborating with other sectors. I think COVID has revealed very plainly that we're all in this together. And I think a lot of great work has happened over the past few years to integrate housing into other discussions, other policy areas, and vice versa. But COVID has really revealed the connections that housing has to 2 things in particular, healthcare and broadband, which our speakers will discuss. And finally, we know that no matter what, our local and regional governments here in Virginia play a tremendous role in making housing available, bringing about new housing opportunities, and partnering with the people that help make it happen. So we're also going to hear from local and regional government reps towards the end about how COVID has changed the way that they think about housing and talk about housing. So the 3 goals that I think for this event we'll try to do, and I'll keep this brief. 1, talk about how things have changed for better or for worse and how we kind of see those trends moving. 2nd, dissect these challenges that we've had and what opportunities we may see in the near future. And finally, I think what we want to do with these xChats is, we know that there's not going to be one silver bullet or one big aha moment that's going to fix things forever. That's just not the way it works. But maybe what these xChats can do, and maybe what today can do, and this entire conference can do, is reveal a lot of little aha moments between all of you. And maybe those are a connection to somebody else. Maybe it's a way to think about things a little differently when you go home. And collectively, all of those little sparks hopefully will start a fire that brings about greater housing opportunity and helps people across Virginia access their home, afford a home, and build wealth. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our Housing Forward Vice Chair of our board, Michelle Crocker, to introduce herself and her panelists and tell us about how they have changed the ways that they talk about housing during COVID. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Jonathan. I have one request. Can this banner be moved? Because I can't see part of the room. They might not want to see me, but I want to see them. And also the other question I have for today is, this is an interactive session. So if people have questions, they can raise their hand or?
Absolutely. So
Okay.
This is we're going to keep it pretty informal. Michelle, you have some questions that you will explore with your speakers up there. But I think once you kind of get through your core questions, whenever you feel appropriate, please feel free to ask the audience for any questions or comments they have. And I'll be over here to tell you when it's time for the next panel.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Crocker. I'm the Executive Director of the Northern Virginia Affordable Housing Alliance. We are a nonprofit housing research, education, and advocacy organization operating in 5 jurisdictions in Northern Virginia. We just celebrated our 17th anniversary, and I am very excited to be here to participate in an in-person governor's conference. So, as Jonathan mentioned, we are going to talk about how we talk about housing, both how we spoke about it before COVID and what has changed since COVID. So I want to introduce my panelists here this afternoon, Erica Holmes and Joe Gelbach, and I'm going to ask them just to say a few words about themselves and where they work in the housing space.
Good afternoon. I'm Erica Holmes. I'm the Director of Flagler Housing and Homeless Services, and we are with St. Joseph Villa. We are in the Richmond area, and we cover not only the greater Richmond continuum, but also the Crater area. So that's the Tri-Cities area, Petersburg, and the 8 localities down there, as well as the board chair of the Virginia Association of Housing Counselors, and we are a state agency that helps to educate and bring training to case managers, housing specialists, anyone that works in the housing industry, just to stay abreast on the different changes and laws.
Hey guys. Okay. I'm Joe Gelbach, as mentioned. I'm the Government Affairs Director at the Richmond Association of Realtors, and so I'm not a real estate licensee, but I advocate on behalf of our roughly 6,000 members in the Richmond area. And we have a little bit of a different perspective on housing and housing issues than most real estate realtor organizations do. We have continually been focused on creating communities of opportunity so that folks can access home ownership at all income levels. And we focus on everything from the basic housing transaction to first-time home buyers and making sure that home ownership is accessible.
Great, thank you. Let's talk a little bit about your elevator pitch for housing. Before COVID, how did you all speak about housing broadly in the community? What were some of the things that you spoke about or emphasized?
So I not only interface with realtors on a daily basis, but I also interface with our local governments and representatives from our state government as well. And one of the things that we've always focused on is, if we don't have enough homes, people aren't going to be able to afford to buy homes. It's a simple supply-demand equation. However, the urgency of that messaging has really stepped up over the last 18 to 24 months, and unfortunately, just the constituencies that folks tend to listen to, the ease of home ownership has gotten farther and farther out of reach for just about everybody. And so now that our average home price in the Richmond region is close to $350,000, that's out of reach for your average one-income household. And that's a problem, especially when our members are invested in buying and selling those homes and assisting their clients. So the urgency of our message has just kind of gone through the roof.
And from housing and homeless services perspective, it's always been an urgency, and we're just glad, those that work in the industry are just glad that other people are also feeling this urgent need for housing, because that's what we've been yelling and screaming about for decades. You know, there's no housing out there that is affordable, even when we're talking about affordable housing, and I put that in quotes because, you know, what is affordable housing for the average single parent household that may just make $20,000 a year, if that, $15,000 a year. You know, it's no rental properties, it's no opportunities to even purchase a home if your income is below that 30%. And so for us, our message is just that we're yelling even louder, but we're glad to have partners at the table, realtors, housing development organizations also seeing the importance of needing housing. Housing first is what, you know, all homeless service providers, DHCD, and all of us have been, you know, advocating for years. So we're glad to have the partners.
And if I could just tee off the back of that, and it's not to say that our messaging hasn't gotten more urgent, it's that we are now finding an urgency among our elected officials, that they're looking to us for solutions now more than they ever have before, which is an incredible opportunity, and being able to make that case that, hey, we need to put more stock on the ground. It can be gentle density, it can be the missing middle, but we just need stock, period, because folks aren't going to be able to enter home ownership price-wise if they can't even afford to afford rental housing to save up for a down payment, right? So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. No, good points. COVID showed us that housing is health, and good health is housing, that if people are not safely and adequately housed, they will be sick, and if one person is sick, we all have the risk of being sick. So that interconnection and that urgency of addressing housing was really made manifest with the pandemic. So given the pandemic, do you think about this? You all spoke about this a little bit, how your message has changed. Is there anything else as you are working in your community, talking to different stakeholders or elected officials or even in community, trying to make sure that housing is developed and preserved? Are there any other frames that you would use in talking to people or that seem to work best? I just referenced one, housing is health. It's something that we used quite a bit in the work that we do, but are there other things that you all talked about?
So housing allows opportunity. Housing is connected to education, right? So if someone is not in housing, they don't have those essentials as far as being able to get to school. We saw that, and it's a session later on about broadband, but we saw that it was, mostly our poverty areas that were affected when COVID hit and they had to stay at home, shelter in place, and it's two things here. It was no homes for a lot of people to shelter in place, right? And so then we as homeless service providers was able to get funding that just kind of appeared, and it's like, where was this funding for the past 20 years or so? But now we have all this money, right? Because the government is like, we have to do something. Although these people have been always homeless and under the bridges, but we're gonna do something now because it's COVID, and we're gonna give you all this money to put people in hotels, which is wonderful. It was, we went out there in the streets, we got people all in hotels. Richmond had about 400, at one time 500 homeless individuals in a hotel. Well, you stop there and we get back to the fact that where do we put these people after they're in the hotel, right? It's no housing to then have that natural flow of, okay, you're here, temporarily, and now we're going to move you into housing. Well, we have no housing to move you into, especially when you have $720 coming in for Social Security disability or something like that. And then the other piece to that was are the families that were having to stay at home, and they can't go to work, so their income is dropping. So they're losing their housing, even with the moratorium that was in place, as well as trying to just access food, make sure their children were still in school. And so housing just showed us that, and this pandemic showed us that without it, everything else, just fell apart. Like we were, but I want to say the good thing. The good thing about it is it affected our middle class people, and so those teachers or those even CNAs or nurses or somebody, they were being affected, and it was like, oh, we have to do something to help them, right? We have to do something to help those that are making $40,000, $50,000 a year, and in that aspect of it, we still have this low income, or no income group of individuals that are homeless that are still exactly where they were before COVID, but just in a hotel until the money runs out.
So the question was, what framing have we been using? And the framing that we've always tried to use is, oh man, we're putting folks to sleep. The framing we've always tried to use, and that tends to resonate across all the kind of political stripes, is the economic argument, is that we are trying to create communities of opportunity where folks want to live today, can afford to live today, and also want to and can afford to live tomorrow, right? And have the same opportunities to succeed as their neighbors, regardless of their zip code. Now, we all know that that's not exactly the reality that we live in. But to make that point of economic, if we're talking about jobs, economic opportunity, creating economic opportunity, and attracting job creators, and again, this depends on who you're talking to, but if we're talking about creating jobs, those employers are going to look for places that their employees can afford to live. And if they can afford to live in the Richmond metro region, we're more likely to get that job creation center, right? So that's one of the frames that we're using. I think we're going to be using more frequently over the next several years. But for us, it's, you can pull at the heartstrings, but sometimes no one's listening. And that's unfortunately, we do live in a capitalist society, and that's the undergirding of that, right? Money talks. So I try to be realistic about it. And those are the pushes that we make. And if we were 100% effective at that all the time, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. But that's where I come from.
So the messaging around housing is kind of foundational. It's fundamental to so many things that are important in the community, to economic development, to family stability, to health. We were very fortunate that the federal government came forward and provided massive amounts of rental assistance to help keep people in their homes. I have a theory about that, and I want to maybe open it up to the group in conversations that we see with elected officials both locally and at the state level. Do you think that the perception among our elected officials is that rental assistance has really addressed the housing problem? Who thinks that? Or do you think more is needed?
You can have you can throw billions of dollars in vouchers and have millions of vouchers, but if there's no place for people to live that accept the vouchers, you're still stuck with someone who has a voucher and might be afford to get to the place they can't find any place.
Right. So the rental assistance was great in keeping people housed, right? You weren't hopefully evicted. But we still know that even pre-pandemic, there were so many people who were struggling. There were so many people who couldn't make their rent, who are in debt already. And so I think for me, the message that we want to send as our elected officials start their General Assembly session in January is let's not forget about the continued investment in both building housing and preserving housing. That $500 million that we got from the federal government was wonderful as a temporary fix. And kudos to both DHCD and Virginia Housing for making the state #1 in distributing that money. But I think part of our messaging around housing, what COVID has revealed to us is how critical housing is, and we need to invest in the infrastructure of housing for our communities and across the state. Yes, you can take, to talk.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I tend to.
It's hard for people to hear you.
I talk too much. Joe, so you're VAR?
The Richmond Association of Realtors.
Richmond.
Local.
Right. You're not, so I work with here, and my area is the creative region. But I think still, that this is, still applicable. I have many things I could ask you, but what do you think what is the realtor influence over, builders and landlords?
Ooh, that's a good question. So we have a close relationship. So, and I'm speaking of the Richmond Association of Realtors. We have a close relationship with the home builders of Richmond, and we don't always see eye to eye. We agree on a lot of issues, but we definitely have places where we disagree. And this goes at this can go at the state level too. For example, on the housing choice voucher, the fair housing law that was just passed, that was something that we hadn't seen eye to eye with just among kind of friends, and it was something that we worked out. We believe that, again, right, housing choice vouchers are only as good as where you can use them, and that that folks who have housing choice vouchers should be able to use them wherever that someone's renting property. So yeah, no, in terms of influence over, we have a working partnership. It's pretty amicable, but we'll knock heads once in a while. We're not afraid.
Yeah. Do you think that your messaging to because this is a systemic problem that isn't always going to be, in my opinion, answered merely by municipalities because of this limited funding. It has to be private partners working with it as well. What about messaging this instead of just, well, this is profitable, but about this being a public good?
Yeah, absolutely. I would shout out our partner nonprofit, the Partnership for Housing Affordability, Jovan Burton, who I'm sure you guys will be hearing from later today. They ran some numbers about basically the fiscal cost of homelessness and the lack of housing, and the kind of the lack of upfront investment really, bites a locality in the tail end at the end of the day. So those numbers were enlightening, and those are numbers that we were able to make, not only the fiscal argument, but the this is a public good argument, and those seem to resonate.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so I had a question because I've been doing this work for about 7 years now.
We're
and-
taping this, so
Okay, I'm sorry.
we want everyone to hear your words of wisdom.
I've been doing this work for about 7 years, and what I've noticed is that each year we say, this is the problem, this is it, let's everybody run to this and do this one thing. What do you guys think it's going to take for us to realize that all of the things are it, and we need to collectively invest in different things? So like even in the previous year, like yes, we've been receiving relief. Yes, the problems are exacerbated by COVID, but what are the efforts that are going into financial as a let me show you how you relate to money, let me show you how to make your own decisions regarding money instead of telling you what to do and how you should do it and what is smart for you as an individual. So like what kind of investment do you guys think it would take to, move us from?
Yeah, we were just talking. So, yeah, I totally on board with what you're saying as far as being, working in homeless and housing now for about 19 years. It really is that holistic approach to case management, and especially working with our most vulnerable population where they have a lot of trauma and they're bringing a lot of trauma and their experience in life, and that all centers around how they spend their money as well, right? And so when we're working with families and individuals, it is having that conversation about housing first, and you want to be able to stay in housing, and we want to connect you to employment. At the same time, we know that people make choices, their behaviors around money stems from anything from culturally to how they were raised, and that I feel is an area that we need to tap into as far as having the funding and the money to educate those that need that really holistic case management approach. We have our rapid rehousing, we have our permanent supportive housing, and all those elements of funding to get people in housing, but then we want to look at the big picture of how do they stay in housing once they're in housing. So, I'll be calling you for that.
I think in Northern Virginia, where I live, we realize that it's not enough just to build or preserve housing, and many of our nonprofit partners and increasingly some of the for-profit developers of affordable housing are creating very robust resident services programs that are looking at those things that you referenced. What do residents need? What are the issues that they are confronting that are keeping them from achieving their best self? So I think you're right on the money. I think the problem is the money. It's hard enough to put your resources together to develop or to preserve, but then to also find funding to do effective case management and services is another challenge. Any other questions or comments that anyone would like to make or share? Y'all are too quiet. You need to wake up. It's the first session. There's 3 more coming. Oh, sorry, Erica.
I have a question for Joe. You mentioned in your intro that the Richmond Realtor Association is not exactly like other realtor associations. So how did that come to be?
I have to, give full credit to our CEO, Laura Lafayette. She's been doing this for a long time, and she's very good at what she does. And it's a top-down philosophy. Laura is extraordinarily skilled and passionate, and she leads our team with that motivation in mind. I used to do grassroots organizing when I was in college and outside of college, and my friends from school give me a hard time about working for the realtors, and give me the kind of like, oh, what are you doing working for the man kind of stuff. But I can throw it back in their face.
It takes all of us to have this conversation. Yes. I'm sorry. Is there someone? Is there someone? Is there another hand that I'm missing? Okay. All right. You have the floor.
Okay. So, how many members are you?
We have roughly 6,000 members.
6,000 members. Mm-hmm. What's your MLS sales volume annual about?
Oh God, I don't know that off the top of my head.
Okay, it's
25,000.
Sales volume?
No, it would be
Sales.
It would be above billion.
Yeah, it would definitely be. Yeah, sales volume would be huge. Yeah.
No, like the sales volume.
I can look it up and get back to you.
No, it's okay. All I was going to do is make a point.
Yeah.
Is that realtors are highly influential to local governments. Maybe not as much as the local pastors, but compared to almost any other group, realtors are incredibly influential. And I wonder what your messaging is to public officials. See, public officials are often just regular folks who want to make a difference in their neighborhood, and they don't have master's degrees in community development. And so they need specific proposals to consider that could help make housing affordable. In other words, you hold their hand and lead them. Are you doing that? I have a wish list of 20 items.
Yeah, I think I'm going to need to get your card. You can get your card later. But you're absolutely right. And one of the things that we try to do at RAR is, we want to be the resource. We have an extraordinary amount of data, of information, of statistics, and we like to share those resources. And so if we can make a compelling case, if we can see a solution that's done somewhere else that we think may work in the Richmond area, we have those conversations with our friends at local governments. Because you're absolutely right, and that's why I would like working with local government, is because, right, there's somebody who, ran for the Board of Supervisors because they saw a problem and they wanted to change it. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
The gentleman in the back.
So I would just say that the Richmond Association of Realtors is one of the most positively influential groups in Richmond on affordable housing. They do make specific proposals to local government all the time. I'm not a realtor or part of that, but I've worked with Laura for years, and she is a machine.
Yep.
And so if everybody, all realtor associations was like the Richmond Association of Realtors, housing would be better across Virginia, I promise you. A second point, I think we all get frustrated over the years because you keep talking about the same stuff over and over again, and why didn't it change? I would respectfully submit that to a private developer of single-family housing, housing is not a public good. It is a private good. They will always think of it as a private good because they're the ones taking the risk, they're the ones spending the money, and they're the ones, therefore, who's creating the good and taking the risk of creating the good. And I suspect that if we think of it, try to think of private developers as developing public goods in that sense. That's different than subsidized housing, directly or indirectly, tax credit, project-based vouchers, all those things which have a clear public financial commitment. But for single-family housing, I think we will disappoint ourselves year after year after year. And so what we ought to do is think about it differently. These are private goods, and the question then becomes, how do you influence those private goods through public policy? And so, obviously a lot of that's going on with luxury dwelling units, zoning, density issues, and all that kind of stuff. But I still think it would be more constructive to think of single-family housing, affordable housing, workforce housing, et cetera, as a private good, and then think about how you deal with the private good. I think that's a more constructive approach.
Good thoughts, good suggestions. Anyone else want to comment on that?
I would just say, it just occurred to me while I was listening to you, is that's almost the same way that we've been kind of framing our conversations in Richmond around auxiliary or accessory dwelling units, is that, we should be respecting the private property owners' private property rights to do what they want with their dwelling. If they want to make an attached granny suite, they should absolutely be able to do that. And who is the local government to stop them, right? And making that argument about individual autonomy and private ownership. I don't know if we've been 100% successful in that yet. The tea leaves are not clear yet. But yeah, absolutely. That's resonated.
So we can certainly look at our land use policies, right? And increase density and allow for different and new housing types. We have a big debate where I live in my part of the state about the percentage of residential development that is single-family detached. In Fairfax County, 82% of residential development is single-family detached. So we need to rethink our land use policies, and I know that's a conversation that's been going on across the state, and some discussions about can we do something at the state level, and local governments who say no, land use is the prerogative of the local government, and we don't want the state telling us what to do. But I think it's a conversation, to your point, that we really need to ramp up and have. So any more questions? We have 5 more minutes. Yes.
Anyway, any examples from you all? Any examples from you all or from the group about public-private partnerships that you've seen that are really effective? That you kind of addressed as a comment in the back.
I have one in Fairfax County. They have a policy of providing public land for the development of housing. Northern Virginia, like other parts of the state, is very expensive to develop. And so making that land available, it is available exclusively for affordable housing development. And up to this point, it's been used exclusively for multifamily rental development. But that's not to say that there couldn't be some sort of consideration for creating home ownership. And that's a big discussion, again, in Northern Virginia about the need for more affordable home ownership. Yes, Bob. You can.
I guess partly in response to Mike and the gentleman up here about the question about public-private partnerships that are effective. Community land trusts are pretty, those are mostly single-family homes. They're a way of creating housing in areas of opportunity that, is affordable and accessible to folks. So, there's folks in the room, who are involved in community land trusts. I think that's a really good model that can kind of bridge that gap.
Good example. And another.
You're beating me to the punchline, Bob. Obviously, the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust has been quite successful in the Richmond region in terms of private-public partnerships. It has now been designated as the land bank for not only the city of Richmond, but Henrico County and Chesterfield County. And 50 houses in the pipeline for the upcoming year? Yeah, so I mean, right, it's 50 houses in the scheme of things is chipping away at the iceberg, but the way that the MWCLT has ramped up has just been incredible.
And Habitat for Humanity just formed a statewide land trust. And the nice thing about their land trust is it doesn't have to be just Habitat properties. Anyone can add their homes. Any developer can add their home to the statewide land trust.
I mean, right now, it's a very small part of the market, but it could be a much greater part of the market that, there are people taking entrepreneurial risks with that. It's made affordable by a lot of different means, some public funding, some philanthropy, and then just the whole model of once established, then the value that's originally captured there benefits all the future owners.
Right.
It's a form of home ownership.
And not only does it benefit the future owners, but it benefits them in a more financially significant way over the years, too. The differential keeps growing.
So I just want to have a comment about something you said earlier, Joe. Yes, we do live in a capitalistic society, and no, everybody is not going to, be emotionally driven to that sob story. But I do believe in the power of relationships, and they don't have to be really emotional. And so I would suggest to RAR and PHA to get married and have a demonstration baby, so to create relationships. You guys have a lot of statistics, as well as PHA has a lot of research that's out there. Creating a narrative and giving it a refresher of trying to tell it from different ways that people learn. So when I was in college, and I'm sure everybody in colleges and Myers-Briggs and figuring out how you learn. I've been testing that with financial management, and when you orient information to the way that somebody learns, you take one thing and you split it out from all the ways that you learn, you can communicate those relationships in a way that it can be translated as capitalism.
Yeah, and I definitely didn't mean that exclusively economic. Yeah, no, both end is always better. I don't believe in black and whites. Gray is good. But yeah, no, absolutely. And Jovan and I, we work down the hall. So, but yeah, we should chat. See if you have ideas. Love that.
All right, I've been given the high sign that our time is up, so thank you all so much for your participation and for listening. We appreciate it. And thank you to my co-panelists.
Those three folks have just scratched the surface, and I'm sure would be happy to talk to any of you offline about what they've mentioned, what they've seen work, what they've seen not work. But without any further ado, let's move on to our second panel. So if we can have Erica, Andy, and Carmen come up. They will talk to us about how COVID has changed their organizations that are on the ground doing some really great, interesting work all over the Commonwealth.
Good afternoon. My name is Erica Sims. I'm co-director of HousingForward Virginia with Jonathan. And I have the honor of hosting this next panel session that is about one of my favorite topics these days, which is capacity. I think that all of us have had our capacity tested through COVID, and coming out of COVID and the new resources that are available for housing, the changes in the labor force, the great resignation as it's called, and all of these other factors that come to impact our capacity. And I'm really honored here today to have excellent speakers in Andy and Carmen who can introduce themselves and their organizations, but represent two very different geographies in Virginia, and I think we're going to have a great discussion around the lessons we've learned about capacity and how we can meet the challenges through growing our capacity moving forward. So, Andy?
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. Thank you, Erica, and it's a real pleasure to be in a room with real people and to rub elbows. It's been a while. I'm Andy Kegley. I'm from Wytheville, Virginia, which is 350 miles west of here. You can still go another 150 miles and still be in Virginia. I just have to throw that out there for people who don't know the geography. And I run Helping Overcome Poverty's Existence. We go by HOPE. We serve a 6-locality area that has 120,000 people, over 6 counties and a city of Galax. And we do a little bit of everything. We do the homeless prevention programs. We do development programs, single family and multifamily. And to make life really interesting, we got into food security, and we're doing a pay what you can restaurant.
Wow. So my name is Carmen Romero. I'm the president and CEO at the Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing, which is based in Arlington, Virginia. We've been around 30 years. And we went regional in 2018. So we went from just serving that 26 square mile area that is Arlington. And we have 2,000 residents in 19 properties today and 5 projects under construction now. So we have 3 parts to our mission. One is the preservation and development of affordable housing in the Washington, D.C. suburbs in Northern Virginia. The second part is to have resident services programs that will both stabilize as well as offer opportunity to our residents. And my colleague, Marquand Jackson in the back, runs that division for APA. And then the third is a policy area that is, our goal there is to promote with the residents that we serve. And I'm excited to be here today to talk a little bit about the challenges that faced us before and after COVID hit.
So Carmen and Andy, I don't want to give you PTSD, but what were your organization's internal and external challenges that you spent the most time thinking about before COVID? And then we'll get to what you're thinking about since COVID.
So pre-COVID, our challenges were not unlike everybody else's challenges. Our homeless programs, we might have had 2 families, households, in a shelter at the local motel. We did a housing summit with Erica and Jonathan just 3 years ago, which kind of blows my mind. That was just 3 years ago. And they came out and talked to some of our local government folks about the need for housing. We thought it was a crisis then. Our average length of stay for those families that were in the motel for the shelter program then was maybe 15 nights. And we had a budget to house for like 500 nights over the course of the year. We were seeing a diminished number of single-family building permits being issued. Prior to the recession, we were seeing it actually peaked about 2004 and 5, over 400, 450 single-family building permits in the town of Wytheville and the county of Wythe. After the recession, that number fell to about 30, and my organization was doing about a third of that. So we were seeing, pre-COVID, we were seeing, I think just sort of the status quo. We were challenged, we had issues, our budget was minimal, our staff was maybe 8 or 9 people. And then, of course, you want me to go into the post-COVID too? So then, our experience post-COVID was, I was with some friends last weekend from Nashville, Tennessee, and they were talking about the homeless problem in Nashville, and I said the same story that I'm saying here. I said that where we had 2 people in the hotel homeless, last summer we had 45, 46, 47 motel rooms occupied in 3 different motels. And the average length of stay skyrocketed because folks can't find the department that we could put them in for rapid rehousing. So that average length of stay is now about 90 nights. We just moved somebody out last week who'd been in 247 nights. That's $11,000 for one family in a motel for almost 2/3 of a year. So our budget skyrocketed with the RMRP program from DHCD last summer, with the other CARES funding and ARP funding. The VHDA grant for nonprofits was a huge shot in the arm. The Small Business Administration, SBA stuff, EIDL, Economic Injury Disaster Loan. But the biggest impact we had was a donor walked in my office last August who I'd never met, who had been a donor to us. And he walked in and introduced himself, sat down at my desk, pulled out of his pocket a check, and he said, "I don't trust the U.S. mail." And it was for $1 million, unrestricted. And what was his name? Yeah, it's a tightly held secret, right?
All of you have that story, right? That happened to everybody in this room, right?
That was a game changer. Carmen?
Okay, I can't beat that. So challenges pre-COVID. Well, I think our biggest issue in Northern Virginia was always this incredible pressure from market forces that descended on the Northern Virginia area as, an investment opportunity for value added for anything that was remotely in the affordable range. And we lost, at least in Arlington, 90% of our unrestricted, naturally occurring affordable housing in the last 15 years prior to COVID hitting. And then Amazon HQ2 announced they were coming to Arlington, and that's even more of a feeding frenzy, and that was all pre-COVID. The Urban Institute, in conjunction with all of the municipalities around Northern Virginia, tried to quantify the supply imbalance that we had, and it's something like 350,000 homes that we need in that region between now and 2030 that need to get built, of which 75% of them need to be in the affordable category or below, and because of our climate crisis, should be near transit. So that was kind of the context pre-COVID. And our nonprofit, along with others, we've got Camilla here from Wesley Housing, we're trying to step up to do more. How can we get to scale? How can we build more housing? So we couldn't compete in preserving these housing units. It's like impossible. We were literally paying for units that probably needed $75,000 a door of work. The going rate was like $200,000 to buy the apartment, right? Huge gaps to do that because the mortgage the subsidies needed were impossible. So we'd just taken to basically new construction. Well then, to do a new construction deal, it would take sometimes 7 years to get a project on the ground. You'd have, where can you find the land? You got to work with the church or a veterans group or public land, and those are usually or maybe you were lucky enough you had something of your own that you could try to get rezoning. And then a rezoning could take 3 years approximately to get through a change in general land use plan and a zoning. Then you got to compete for the local gap money because you can't build anything with what it costs to build today without a gap locally. Then you have to compete at the state level for the tax credits. You line that up, it's like my kids could be project managers on a project that I start today. And they're like one of them's like barely in middle school. That's how long it takes to build a single project. So that was pre-COVID. And then, internally, my boss had told me 3 years ago that she wanted to retire and wasn't sure exactly when. So those were all the things that were sort of on our mind before COVID hit.
And tell me after COVID now. Get us to the punchline.
So COVID hits, and we had put under construction our biggest project ever, a $90 million project, was under construction, about halfway done. We'd also invested about $5 million of our balance sheet to tee up a new project that we would be working on for 5 years with a third party that was supposed to close on Cinco de Mayo, April, a month later. So when it hit, our first thought was, are we going to go bankrupt? I mean, candidly, are they going to shut down our construction project on our $90 million project where we've done construction guarantees to investors that our nonprofit's going to have to fund? This other project, will we ever get to closing? And the investor was really nervous. Was the governor going to shut down construction, or were they going to let us continue? Thank God. Unlike New York, Virginia kept it moving. And that $90 million project got built 2 months early, thankfully. So, that delivered. So that was our first crisis. And then the residents. We were in the midst, we had just hired a resident services director, the one prior to Marquand. She started a week before COVID hit. And so all of a sudden, our residents that had been making it, because we're, affordable at 60% AMI, people had jobs, and then they lost their jobs. So they're calling, the phone's ringing off the hook. We have a new director in that area, a tiny team, and then we needed to try to get those services out, and we didn't have $1 million check, unfortunately, but we were able to raise, I think, around $200,000 for emergency needs, so that we could, get in, made sure that people had food and essential supplies to try to get through that first period of COVID.
If I could add a note to our experience, so like with Amazon and HQ2 dropping on Alexandria, Northern Virginia 4 years ago, 3 years. A month ago, we're Southwest Virginia is in the heights or the depths of high COVID transmission. The governor comes out on October the 4th to Wytheville and makes an announcement that was a bit of a surprise that a company, a brand new company called Blue Star, has won a Department of Defense contract to make, for the first time in the U.S., the blue nitrile gloves that were lacking here for the pandemic. And this is going to be a $750 million investment. It's going to employ 2,500 people. It's going to be under production late 2022. And all those other numbers I told you, all the other shortage of housing, all the other crises we're dealing with, just got exponentially blown up. The governor said it was a game-changing announcement for Southwest Virginia and for our locality. But now we're adding on to all of our existing challenges. How do we respond to that?
And you told me, Andy, that 2,500 jobs was equivalent to 10%?
10% of the population.
Population?
Yeah, and folks will be moving in from somewhere. It's a little disconcerting. The average. The only number we've seen so far is the average salary is going to be $37,000, which is about $18 an hour. So proportionate to, I think the number from Amazon was like 150,000 maybe average. You know, this is dramatically lower, and it's going to call for affordable housing, workforce housing, in a big number. And we need to have partners with everybody, local government, Virginia Housing, DHCD, private investors, whoever, to house these folks. It's interesting, I was talking to our new friend back here a moment ago, that because this is a Department of Defense contract, and we've heard rumblings that maybe this company is going to be providing some housing for their employees, that because it's a DoD project, there might be some talk of sort of a workforce housing for refugees, which will add a really fascinating layer to a conservative part of the state.
So I want to make sure anyone in the audience who has a question raises their hand. Tiffany.
And so Andy and I were having this discussion here. I think one of the challenges, I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia, and so housing has just been a huge issue there in Virginia. But one of the challenges that we don't think about looking forward in terms of bringing new jobs and expanding housing inventory, especially when we talk about refugee population potentially, is the impact that it's going to have on the school system. Whether or not the school has the capacity to accommodate those students. And I'm on the next panel on broadband, so I won't go further than that in terms of distance learning, but it would be really interesting to see if there are models like the purpose-built communities model that can combine broader development, not just the housing units, but also directly impact.
Well, as far as education goes, you know, our county student population has dropped from 4,400 to about 3,600 just in the last 5 or 10 years. So the population's been declining. But we're also guessing that with 2,500 new workers, that could mean 1,200 to 1,500 new students. So we will need new schools, and we haven't built a new school in forever. You know, new schools haven't been built in Southwest Virginia in forever because they're declining populations. And even the quality of the schools, you know, that's a huge issue, that we're not funding rural schools like we are in Northern Virginia. And so that's a lagging indicator of an ongoing problem.
And we certainly have a lot of school-age kid population growth, and candidly, a lot of times, you know, it's a tool used by NIMBYs to try to stop an affordable housing project from moving forward. And ironically, though, most of the strain on school capacity, at least in my neck of the woods, has been people demoing small single-family homes and building enormous new homes. So a lot of it's coming from the single-family home population more than, because I told you how hard it is for us to actually get an affordable housing deal built. So it's not, you know, it's not just us, but that is certainly part of that narrative. And we are now, in the prior panel, they talked about policy changes to try to make single-family homes, you know, address the missing middle problem by allowing duplexes and triplexes and townhomes to happen. We're in that battle too. And what we're saying is, you know, it's an equity issue. You know, we can't just have, you know, 2 housing typologies in the county. We have to be able to have, you know, a range of housing affordability and ladders for people to create wealth in our community that aren't, you know, the average single-family home price in Arlington is well over $1 million. That's the average. Some will go into the 2 or 3s. Right? We need other housing typology if we're going to really live the values of wanting to be a diverse and inclusive community. And we can't let things like school capacity or, you know, the narrative around, you know, stormwater infrastructure being lacking. They've got to be able to do both. As a, you know, the county government has to be able to build schools, create more capacity for climate change, but don't use that as a wedge issue between the need for affordable housing and the need for supply. Those are problems they've got to fix anyway.
So, Andy, thinking about your post-COVID increase in resources, the dramatic increase in housing need where you are, and Carmen has been thinking now about all of the infrastructure funding from the federal government. When you think about Hope's internal capacity, how do you think about that? What are you trying to do now to make yourself able to take advantage of these resources and to meet these new challenges?
Good question. It feels like what we've done is sort of a major step forward while also taking a step or two backwards. What I mean by that is in September, I told my staff we were going to have a mandated vaccine. One staff member walked out the door. 2 others said they would if the board adopted that policy. I sat down with my board and we agonized and we ended up compromising. We ended up saying, get the vaccine or do weekly testing on your own. So I've kept those 2 other people who were at risk of losing them. And so that's been a hit to our organization. On the other hand, though, I have just right now hired a very accomplished young gentleman who's going to be starting with us in just a couple of weeks, specifically to build, to do deals. In the past, that would have been on my list of jobs to do, and in a small organization with now 10 or 11 people and a pretty diverse mission and a pretty diverse portfolio and not large, things didn't happen very fast. So the 7-year deal in Northern Virginia could be twice that with me.
And same for you, Carmen. You're in a urban market. There's a lot of labor market competition. What do you think about in terms of your organization's internal capacity? Are you putting your foot on the gas pedal right now, trying to grow as fast as you can and retain good employees? Or are you thinking about that next cycle that happens, perhaps in the next 10 years and, a retraction that maybe you had to do around 2008? How are you thinking about that?
So we are very much in the growth mode. We've hired a ton during COVID. I don't even know the number. It's probably 7, 10 people. We're up to, almost 40. And we are hiring in that resident services area that Marquand leads. When we started COVID, we were 4 people. We are now 12. And we are hiring people right out of school who are interested in making a difference. And we are training them up and teaching them what it's like to be in community with our residents, because we learned in COVID, you can't serve 4,000 people with a staff of 4 doing outreach to residents. And now we've got to get the funding to catch up with it. Our board was willing to use some of our balance sheet. Philanthropy will only pay for so much, and we're looking at new models. And so we are frankly advocating, so philanthropy will continue and they'll always play a part, but I know Virginia Housing is thinking about in their QAP adding points for resident services. Could they add changes to developer fee for people who commit to resident services, long-term implementation to go with the bricks and mortar that are getting built? We are also looking at operational cash flows. Where can we squeeze our operations enough to start paying for some of that really important, more social work, navigating, because we can't do it the way we were doing it before and really do our mission.
Yeah, Erica.
When you just talked about just how your staff has grown and you're looking funding and all that, what has changed or has anything changed around your diversity at your job? And have you implemented, I know the big thing that happened is everyone's doing diversity and inclusiveness in their organizations. It's a big build, a capacity need there. Was that something you all were already doing pre-COVID, looking into ensuring that you have a diverse staff as well as diverse board? Or is that a need now that you are working on in your organizations to build?
So I'll start. We were already on that journey, thankfully, before COVID hit, but it was certainly amplified and accelerated as part of it. You know, we have a 26-person board of directors, of which we intentionally recruited 7 more diverse board members in the course of the last couple of years, and we want to even do more than that. But we actually also have residents that sit on our board. We have 2 today. You know, as part of the CEO transition, the board was really leaning into, you know, letting me amplify the fact that I'm Latina from an immigrant household, and candidly, you know, giving me the freedom to kind of lean into that and amplify that as, you know, part of giving me space to like do a reflection on, you know, what that means to me to now lead an organization where a lot of our residents are like me and my family when we came to the United States in the 60s, right, without any resources, and that second generation impact that we can have as APA to be that place for, we have 1,400 kids that live in our properties. Every child at APA should have the same opportunities I was given, and you know, that was part of the ready lens that went into the CEO transition, and how do they make room for me to step into this role.
That's a great story. My story isn't as clear or as a good outcome. And we have some diversity on the staff, but with now 11 employees, that means there are 2. My board is a Chodo board, so it's a board of 18. And so it represents the community, and there are 2 people of color on the board and 6 who live in or represent low-income areas of our service area. But my board has gotten much more engaged in the last 18 months, and we know we have work to do.
I direct a relatively small niche market affordable housing provider. We've been successful and have a lot of capacity gains financially that Andy talked about over the last year, except for $1 million. And we've had some unusual just drop out of the envelope stuff on the ground that takes pride. We created a staffing plan. The question I really have here around this is, we need to develop capacity. The market we serve for disabilities, we recognize that market's underserved everywhere. And we can expand regionally, yet we're small. And when I hear upstaffing, this I guess is around the Arlington partnership. You go from 40, you have 40 on staff, you go from 30 to 40, and you bring in people and you're going to train them up. That's got to put a lot of pressure on the organization, because these people have to perform. And I recognize that because I'm trying to hire one person that can't find them, and need to hire 2 more in the next year for an organization, and that puts pressure on us to be able to perform what we're doing within the realm of what we can do, and be able to still train up somebody else, bring them in with no experience. I've got to do that. The question really I'm trying to still form it is, how do you deal with the pressure of that upstaff when you got to do it? Ain't nobody else going to train them. You can send them out, and that's my Southwest Virginia call. They ain't going to train them. When you know the question. This is hard. And I'd like to hear how you're dealing with the hard.
Yeah, no, it is hard, and Marquand, you know, is the person who's grown the most in COVID, bringing on, he himself being new, right? So you moved here from Michigan to take the job to run the resident services group, and you said, Carmen, we can't serve 4,000 people with 4 people. I'm hiring 12. Are we doing this? We're doing this. And we went to the board, we're doing this. And you're right, it is very hard. But the good thing that my board also said is, we're going to invest in coaching at all levels of the organization so that we are giving managers a tool. Our senior team, you know, we were a young senior leadership team, but together we have 55 years of work at APA. So even though I'm the oldest person on senior leadership, we've all been there. I was there 11 years. We have 3 or 4 other people who've been there 8 years. We got to keep the team together. So my first goal is retention of the senior leadership team, pairing that with, we hired a coach for that senior team to work with us once a month, just as a cohort of the 8 of us, so that we had a facilitator talk about the challenges of a transition, of COVID, of hypergrowth, and creating a one organization cross-department mindset of we're going to get through this, we're going to grow, and we're going to do this as a team, and we're going to break down silos. And that's really been a transformation that we have done in the course of the last year and are working on. But it's definitely not easy. It's hard work to recruit, to train, to mentor. But I think if you hire the right people who want to innovate, who are really just committed to the work, like I have in Marquand and that group, and I have in the real estate that same kind of leadership, and everyone's kind of rowing in that direction, but it all comes down to who's leading that effort.
And the only thing I would add to that, Jeff, is that finding the passionate person who is embracing the mission is going to be key. And then as the training, we have limited access where we are out in Southwest Virginia, but you can expect a phone call from my new guy who's going to come visit you, and he's going to go to VAGHC, and he's going to go to and he's going to go to Abington, and he will be looking for other scalable organizations to ours to shadow and learn from.
If I could follow up with a quick question, it's related to the same thing, although it doesn't seem like it. Post-COVID, we've had a ton of cost increases on properties. Dealing with that at the same time is an additional pressure, trying to pull those dollars, either finding dollars, pulling those costs back in somehow within some semblance of what they ought to be. How's that going?
We don't have our project is not under construction. I'm dealing with increases on paper, and we'll be confronting it in real life probably the next quarter, but can't speak to that now.
And I think what saved us is we've always been very conservative with big contingencies that have served us well. So I think, I'd say that through any cycle, we carry 7% hard cost contingency on any project we move forward, and we lose a lot of deals because we're so conservative, and maybe that inflates what the gap is. A lot of developers will tell you any story to win an RFP, tell you any story to sell their board or we don't play that game. Put forward something that's conservative, and that project that I told you, the $90 million one that I thought was going to potentially kill us, we ended up having savings, significant savings. With that, we created a digital divide reserve so that for the next 15 years, we can offer free Wi-Fi to everyone in the residence. If things go well, you'll be able to do more mission. You'll be able to maybe lower rents. You'll be able to do more. If you cut it to the wire, it's like the opposite phenomena. You've destabilized everyone. You're, cutting things out at the 11th hour, and we've just really tried to be disciplined about that.
We're going to do Carolyn and then Bon.
Is that coming from the elected officials, or is that coming from the communities? And then if so, what kind of advocacy efforts are you guys doing within the communities? Who are you connecting with so that you can create pockets of people who can advocate for why this is important?
Well, I'll start, and then, it's not coming from the elected. I think we have very progressive, committed, elected leadership, but they are under political pressure from people who don't want to see density and development, much less from folks who they view are going to bring down their property values. So we do need kind of a PR type of campaign to help us, and, our best allies, frankly, have been the faith community. Has been amazing, they over and over again, but we need more than that because candidly, we are really struggling.
And my elected officials have been hearing us talk about housing needs for a couple of years. I think it was all kind of abstract until a month ago. They're in the middle of updating their comprehensive plan, and frankly, we've been having conversations just quickly in the last month saying, you know, you guys need to step up and do some big things fast. I mean, they really have to pull the levers of government and enact all those things that they can. And again, I live in a pretty conservative part of the state, so it's going to be a challenge.
Vaughn?
No, I was just going to react to the question about how to deal with these increasing costs of material costs. What we had considered doing, facing those same material costs and the shortfalls, was to look at warehousing material. Looking at going out and finding space, talking to our contractors, and seeing what we could do to help them warehouse material, going to their suppliers and saying, if we do a bulk purchase, can you set it aside so that it's there? We didn't end up pulling the trigger on that because there was no supply to be had. And so, but I do think, what I take from that is, as a small organization, we need to start reaching out to our sister organizations and see where we can work together. I like the idea of the cohort and looking at small orgs getting together and saying, can we get together and bring in a coach? Can we get together and look at how to train our young staff? I think one of the trends that we need to recognize in Virginia is that a lot of our housing staff is getting older. And so we've got to look at that new generation coming up and thinking about how we can grow them up.
Great. Well, I think that's it for time. Thank you both so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica, Andy, and Carmen. I think those were some really necessary inward-looking conversations to the organizations that help deliver housing on the ground in Virginia. But now we're going to look kind of outward a little bit and have Tiffany, Sherry, and Kyle come up and talk about their areas of expertise, which are not housing, and that's okay. They're going to tell us in more detail about trends in broadband and healthcare and ways that COVID has changed their fields and what we as housers should be aware of. I think we all recognize that good internet access, as this is being live streamed to several hundred people right now, how important that is to everybody these days, and healthcare as well. So I think this will be a great conversation for all of you to hear. So without any further ado, Tiffany, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. I didn't get to ask my fellow panelists if you mind if I take off my mask. I just took the booster shot last week, so I'm still recovering. Yes, my name is Tiffany Holland-Wright from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. It's been really interesting preparing for this particular panel. I remembered, because I had forgotten, because I've been in the financial sector for a while, that I was a resident services manager at a mixed income property for 5 years. And that was a decade and some ago. But we weren't thinking about the intersection of health, housing, and broadband. Everyone was having to take care of their own broadband. And now I've heard it referenced even as a super determinant of health, because it's a multi-solver. It requires that families, particularly vulnerable families, have access so that they can pay bills, go to school, work remotely, access health care. So this has been really eye-opening for me, and I'm super excited to have our guests join us. Sherry and I both sit on the HousingForward Virginia board, but we've only met each other over the phone because of the pandemic. And I will let them actually do some introduction of themselves if they like, but I just want to say that Sherry is with Centara Health, and she's provides strategic oversight for their corporate social responsibility function, and she's got 20 years in various administrative and case management and nursing leadership roles. So I'm excited to hear from her. And also Kyle served on our Broadband Summit panel that the Federal Reserve held in June of this year. And Kyle has a big title, I might get it wrong. Deputy Broadband Advisor for the Virginia's Office of the Governor, Ralph Northam, and he also leads our Virginia Commonwealth Community Connect Coalition. Okay. And he's helping to develop the Virginia Digital Equity Plan. So, you know, lots of money is coming down, and these folks are trying their best to prepare us as a state to be ready to deploy it and to see how these sectors intersect, but also how they intersect with other sectors. Right now, we know only a quarter of households in America have broadband access. 59% of households that are earning $20,000 or less do not have broadband access. So this is a major issue. So that said, the Fed cares because at this point, if people can't get access to broadband, they can't get a job, or they're limited in their options, and so therefore, it is a workforce issue. So with that, I'm gonna start off with our very first question, and that's gonna go to Kyle. We haven't practiced, so we're just gonna flow.
Yeah.
All right.
Good with it.
So Kyle, the pandemic prior to this was an issue.
Mm-hmm.
What were the major policy issues that your office was facing related to broadband deployment in the state?
Prior to the pandemic?
Prior to the pandemic. And then you can go from there into what opportunities it's created.
Sure. So we like to say if there's anything good that's come out of the pandemic, it's kind of put to rest the debate on whether we should be investing public dollars into broadband. But for those of you who work in rural or underserved communities, you know that broadband was an issue well before the pandemic, before people were working at home. You know, when we first came into office, Governor Northam set the goal for universal broadband, and at that time we set what we thought was an aggressive goal of 10 years, so 2028. That's a tough swallow to tell someone in second grade that you're not going to get broadband. You know, a family with a kid in second grade, they're not going to get broadband for another 10 years. But you know, infrastructure is expensive and it's not quick. So we took a stab at kind of understanding the problem. When you think of the digital divide, we like to break it down, and there's two sides of the coin. One side is access, so if you have access to the infrastructure outside of your home or business. And for that, we estimated that there was around 500,000 homes and businesses in Virginia that did not have access. And then there's those who don't have access because of affordability. And that is a much tougher nut to crack, and one that no state that we've seen around the country has cracked yet. I'll share a little bit more about, we think the feds are stepping up finally, and there's going to be some meaningful subsidies for broadband to come. But all that's to say, we've spent most of the past 3 years focused on the access side. And we're happy to say in that time, we've closed half the digital divide. So we now think that there's around 233,000 households that don't have broadband. But that's been our laser focus, and it really comes down to funding, which is, you know, in most of public policy, it comes down to funding. If the money's there, we can get a lot done. If it was not there. So before COVID, we were really having to leverage all of our partnerships and all of our stakeholders to make sure that legislators knew how much broadband was, you know, how it touched every sector. And this is a fun panel for me because it's talking about how it relates to other sectors. Well, I consider broadband like electricity. So it's like asking, how does electricity relate to other sectors? It's like, well, it touches everything, you know? So it should be easy for me.
Some really resonating points there. Broadband is now a utility, all right? And also permanent solutions to broadband access and addressing the digital divide require policy changes. So Virginia is leading the way in many aspects, as Kyle pointed out. And I just want to say, he mentioned that the feds have money. That does not include the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. And these opinions are my own and not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve System. But yes, we do have some influence as far as how some of our financial institutions choose to spend their money to support access. So Sherry, I'm going to come to you next. And can you talk to us a little bit about healthcare and how the pandemic has created opportunities for healthcare to really expand its alternative healthcare service delivery models?
So just by show of hands, in the room, who's visited an emergency room in the last year? Did you get in and out quickly? So I have spent the bulk of my career as a nursing leader, case manager, social work, care coordination, navigator, resident servant. I didn't do that, but in that realm of delivering and connecting people to services. Before the pandemic, healthcare suffered critically from what we would call capacity issues. So to bring the connection between health and housing, I'm gonna hopefully put the mind-blown meme in your head. We were already having extreme capacity issues. If you had a trauma or if you had a heart issue at an outlying hospital and needed to go to a hospital, for instance, for a very specific service, you might wait 3 or 4 days. So think about the impact on the community that folks who don't have housing, whether it's emergency, whether it's scattered, whether it's affordable, whether it's thermal shelter, think about the impact that that has on the community, because people need to seek shelter. They need food. They need social determinants. They need broadband. They need electricity to charge their phones. So not to say that every person that comes in the emergency room is seeking a social issue, but to say that when the housing component is missing, it can greatly, severely impact how we deliver care. So I would take the broadband statement one step further and say it's as important as those things, right? It is a social determinant of health. And so fast forward to today, post-pandemic, and I heard this mentioned earlier, we have critical staffing issues. We have people reserving visits to healthcare providers because they're scared to go into the emergency room. And if they had access, for instance, to broadband, telehealth, monitoring, they wouldn't necessarily have to go, and they could still receive the care that they needed in their home.
I appreciate that, Sherry. I think the state has offered a lot of relief dollars, and there's been some expansion of physicians being able to file for reimbursements for providing telehealth care. So we have a workforce issue here, and they've kind of got to upskill a little bit. So we'd love to hear more about that. Let's talk about federal relief packages, infrastructure bill, all that good stuff. Kyle, take us through it.
So there have been a few stimuluses at this point, I guess stimuli. And, you know, all that's to say, broadband has been at the forefront of all these packages, going back to even before the first COVID, really. When COVID first hit, the feds very smartly established what they called the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. And this was a temporary program, $50 a month broadband subsidy to help pay for low-income households' broadband bills, essentially. That was a huge step up from what federal support had been there in the past, which was the Lifeline program, which was around $9.25 a month, which is, for all of you who pay your broadband bills every month, you know that doesn't cut it. $50 a month in some communities still doesn't cut it, but it went a lot farther. So we're really happy to see that. And then, of course, the American Rescue Plan was really the biggest one. And the flexible, we have been screaming from the rooftops about the need for flexible funding. The federal broadband grant programs that have happened in the past have been very inefficient. They've, in some ways, made the problem worse because they've perpetuated kind of this Swiss cheese. They're only funding little portions of localities for providers who might not be the provider of choice by that locality. So the American Rescue Plan provided immense flexible dollars to the state, and in July, Governor Northam and the General Assembly allocated $700 million ARPA dollars to our broadband program, which was just a tremendous boost to our efforts, and it accelerated our original timeline of universal broadband by 4 years. So now we're shooting for 2024. All that's to say, we depend on localities and public-private partnerships to get this money out the door. So we don't sit in Richmond and say this money's going to go here and it's going to connect these houses. We depend on public-private partnerships, typically a county or a group of counties partnering with a broadband provider, coming in saying this is how much we're going to provide, both private match and public match, and these are the households that we need covered, and this is what we need the state to cover. And we had $750 million available this round. We were blown away by the response. We got $943 million in applications from 84 Virginia localities. Pretty much all the unserved localities in Virginia came in. It was really an outpouring of support that we didn't think was going to happen. So now we're in the midst, we're having the hard time of sorting through all these applications, reviewing them. Unfortunately, we're going to have to say no to some because we don't have $943 million. But it's going to take a huge, huge bite out of the apple. And we're going to be announcing, Governor Northern's going to be announcing those awards next month. And it's really going to set up Governor Youngkin to finish this out on time, maybe even before 2024. And Virginia is going to be one of the first large states in the nation to close the digital divide, at least on the access side.
So that's exciting. It's really interesting because the Digital Equity Act of 2021 requires that the state has a digital equity plan, which you're working on. So do you think you'll be going for those dollars as well?
Yeah, definitely. DHCD has an Office of Broadband run by Dr. Tamara Holmes, and their main focus has been the VAGHC program, but now they're staffing up to where we can focus on affordability as well. And we're hoping the infrastructure package that just came through, that money is clear and defined that it could be used for affordability purposes. So delivering, buying equipment for multi-family units to provide free Wi-Fi, those type of things. We're hoping that the agency will be empowered to do those kind of things. But it's kind of tough for me to sit here because I'm going to be out of a job here in 2 months, and the next administration is really going to hold the key for a lot of these things. And I'm very confident that they're going to continue on the access side of things. On affordability, I think that's going to be a more uphill climb. But this is a new issue for most states. No one's really found the right path to getting this done. And the feds have just, in the infrastructure package that passed like last week, they're going to make that emergency broadband benefit program that I mentioned permanent. They're going to reduce the amount from $50 to $30 a month, but it's going to be permanent. So we think that's a huge step. And even though they've reduced the amount, we think because it's permanent, a lot more providers are now going to participate. Before they didn't want to because they didn't want to provide free service just to have the money dry up and have to take that service away. Now that it's permanent, we think there will be a lot more participation in it. So that's a good step towards solving the affordability problem.
All right, terrific. I know the Digital Equity Act will also expand access to social support through broadband for those who are disabled. And so that brings us back to telehealth, which is also a new thing, and everyone's still trying to figure it out. And before I go further, I just want to do a quick time check. Okay.
20 minutes.
Thank you. Oh, wonderful. Okay, so we're going to dig in even more now. So Sherry, Kaiser Family Foundation found that 1 in 4 Medicaid enrollees lives in a home with limited internet or computer access. And not only to Kyle's point, is it about access, but it's also about access to equipment, laptops. There are a lot of people are smartphone dependent, and they're not able to really fully access services because there's only so much you can do on your phone. If you are at the reading glasses stage, I actually have 3 different prescriptions, one for the computer, one for reading, and one for seeing distance. So I can't see any of y'all right now. So Sherry, can you talk to us about what Centara's been doing in the health sector to help vulnerable populations and how telehealth has been able to meet some of those demands that you talked about earlier?
So I don't want to get away from this conversation because I could talk about it for a really long time without saying for those in the room who do resident services, making sure there's a connection back to the Medicaid complex care manager, making sure that there's phone calls and connections being made back to the health plan because of the expanded reimbursement for what we would consider high-need individuals. So I'll leave you with that, and certainly we can connect offline about why it's so important to reach out to case managers, because you may be not utilizing a resource that's available or duplicating. So just keep that in mind. So telehealth, and I'll tell another story, is been critical to providing care for seniors, vulnerable populations, homeless populations. In one case, we partnered with the city here in Norfolk, and somebody mentioned the hotel project earlier. We deployed cameras and equipment to a population of patients, number one, who were in a congregate setting who we would never deliver health care to. So not only did we reach them, but we were able to establish some chronic disease management, prevent emergency room admissions, and through the course of what we found to be an extended, we call the Safe Hotel program, we were able to connect residents to their health insurance plans. They weren't in an eligibility stream before, and through that program, because they had a congregate housing model, we were able to connect them through resident services to health plans, telehealth, and other things. We had some huge success stories with that. Out of the 110 individuals in the hotel, 107 of them were connected to Medicaid and health insurance, which is a huge percentage. So they were able to access not only health care, behavioral health, transportation, and the list goes on. Not to mention, like I said before, connection to their case manager through their health plan. But the telehealth also, if you think about it from the perspective of volumes being down in the healthcare arena, provided a way for providers to have a whole new list of clients that they were managing all throughout the pandemic, which also reduced our emergency room visits for those particular patients. So wildly success story on all fronts as it relates to access to healthcare, access to telehealth, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. You and I talked a little bit about mental health access as well. So I don't know if you could just take a couple of moments to talk about the availability of counseling. I can't tell my family's business, but all of us have had to do counseling basically just to get through the pandemic. How has that helped in your sector?
Well, it's not perfect. Let's just say that. The availability of clinicians is I would say, a crisis. And we can all see that just from a simple Google search. There's a lot of work going on, and I'm spending a phenomenal amount of time learning about best practices for peer support, telepsych, early warning signs, early identification. And this really goes back to foundations and people who are doing this work out of an extreme mission to solve a huge issue. So we do use telepsych. We can use that in an emergency room. And again, I'll say if you've ever been in an emergency room where there are behavioral health issues going on, it's scary. I mean, it's real. The individuals are not in a place where they can adapt. It's not a flexible environment. It's usually hostile in the sense that you have to have law enforcement. So telehealth is good. It's really good on the non-emergency side. And certainly we would want to be able to access and give people more access to counselors and others through telehealth. But there's a lot of work. I don't want to walk away from here saying that that's a problem that's solved today. We all have some work to do on the behavioral health front.
All right, so let's all say it together. Broadband is a utility. 1, 2, 3. Broadband is a utility. Okay, we've established it. And you want to be able to access this service from your home. So home-based broadband is very important. So Kyle, I know there's been a Connect Home program that HUD has funded. It was a pilot started in 2015 in 3 areas, and Virginia have taken advantage, and basically in this region, Chesapeake, Portsmouth, and Norfolk. And this program is started out with 56 participating communities across the nation. The goal is to get to 100. so that any of the redevelopment housing authorities are sure to be able to provide services. So I think with new construction, which we had this conversation before, you know, you're putting your fiber, I'm out of my league here. You know, there's fiber around the building and it's easy to connect so that each of the households can receive it. But still, I mean, what are the opportunities to partner with other sectors to make sure that we can have home-based internet access?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, something that doesn't get talked about enough probably is when we build these networks out, well, when the state funds these networks to be built out, they're only, the take rate, which means how many customers that have the service actually sign up, is less than 50%, which is really alarming because we spend a lot of these public dollars and a lot of time and resources to get it out there. But I suspect, I haven't done this, but I suspect if you go back and look at what the take rate was for electricity when it was first introduced, or phone service, it was likely around the same rate. So I'm confident that the take rates are going to go up in future years just because, you know, older folks are seeing from their neighbors who are getting it, you know, maybe I do need to use this. And, you know, I think when I looked up a few stats just about COVID and what it's done to society. During COVID, there was a 52% increase in telehealth usage. That's astronomical. There's never been an increase like that, even close to that. Also during COVID, I think 70% of workers were working from home at one point, and Pew just did a study where they found 54% of workers want to telework even after they can go back to the office safely. So healthcare, education, working, it's all changed fundamentally forever, I think. We're not going to turn back. So now we have to figure out how do we get this broadband out to everyone? How do we ensure that people know all the tools that they can use it for? So that kind of brings us to digital adoption. So you think of digital equity, making sure everyone has it and it's a fair price. Accessibility, making sure everyone can just have it. And then there's digital adoption. So once it's out there, how to ensure that people actually adopt it and use it. I'll briefly touch on one project. We were just down in Surry County, which is right up the road, for an announcement. They're going to be one of the first counties in Virginia to achieve universal broadband. They, I think, are going to have it, there's some Surry County folks maybe, I think they're going to have it at the end of next month, which is really exciting, and that's state funding helped play a part in that. But we were down at the Surry County Community Center, and the ISP there, the Internet Service Provider, which is Prince George Electric Cooperative, they have set up, I don't know what they call it, I guess it's an adoption center, but it looks like a living room when you walk in there, and they have computers everywhere, and they have staff on site, and what they're hoping is to work with local organizations, churches, civic organizations, to bring in folks to show them how to use broadband, and show them all the tools beyond just Netflix or Google, to show them all the tools that can be used via this broadband. So I thought that was an amazing thing that the community and the ISP are partnering together, and communities and organizations can do that now. You don't have to wait for a state-funded project, and that's something, if you can walk away from this, you know, I would talk to your locality and see if that's something that would be possible. Even if your locality has service, I guarantee you there's still people out there who aren't taking the service because they think they don't need it.
We want to get to questions. I'm sorry, I see a gentleman with his hand up there, and then this young lady with the beautiful maroon sweater will come to you next.
So what speed is the connectivity in Surry?
Surry is a fiber to the home network, so up to a gig symmetrical. And that's a good question on speeds. The current definition for broadband that the state has is you're unserved if you have access to 25/3 or less. The feds, with the infrastructure package that just passed last week, they've put their new threshold at 100/20. If I were a gambling man, I would put a lot of money that the state is going to follow that. We've always followed what the federal definition was. With that said, the vast majority of networks that the state is funding are deploying well beyond the minimum speeds. It's usually very high speed.
Thank you. Yes.
So you mentioned that you're going to be out of a job. What are your concerns about the person that's going to be
This is Yeah, I mean, listen, affordability is a tough nut to crack because accessibility, everyone can get behind. Yeah, these people don't have internet. Even the companies themselves can get behind, yeah, let's get them internet. When you start talking about affordability, there's an issue with the current private providers because most of them have their own affordability plans that they offer. That has not been sufficient enough, in my opinion, because we haven't seen universal access across the board. So I think we're really in a new day and age with all the federal money that's coming down that can be used for affordability purposes. And when I say affordability purposes, again, this means funding public authorities, so publicly owned networks, to provide free service to vulnerable communities. That is something that is a political hot topic, to be honest. And I'm just not sure what the next administration's position will be on this.
And I want to do just one more time check.
I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
I had a second.
Sure.
That. So you answered what I was asking you, but the next question would be, what are you preparing for how you're going to communicate the importance of the next step to the next cabinet?
Yeah. Yeah, we absolutely are. We have a Commonwealth Connect report. So the General Assembly requires our team to put together an annual report that kind of talks about the state of broadband. Like I said, I would say 95% of our focus has been on the accessibility problem, just because when we first took office, that program was at $4 million a year. We are now up to $750 million a year, and the Governor Northam's outgoing budget is going to have another $100 million for it. We feel very good about where we're leaving that. For affordability, we were able to fund a few projects through the CARES Act, affordability projects in like City of Portsmouth, City of Hopewell, Martinsville, a few projects here and there, Arlington, but that was a one-time funding infusion. This past session, the General Assembly included money to the Department of Social Services to create what they're calling the Virginia Digital Equity Fund, and this is essentially a subsidy. And they didn't fund it, they just asked DSS to look at it, which the General Assembly likes to do. They like to create something and then not fund it. But they asked DSS to look at it, create the program. We helped them with that. So they're ready to fund up, and we're hoping this General Assembly session, there will be money in the budget to fund that program. And that will help that $30 a month federal program that I mentioned. We can help booster that, and we can even aggregate it like we do other federal subsidies. We can aggregate it and help drive up demand. But again, affordability, it's really a new thing. We asked the Pew Charitable Trust, who do research in all 50 states about this, we asked them what state is doing it right on affordability, and they didn't have one. So we're really leading the way in a lot of ways. We're hoping that what we've laid out will be good enough, and I'm hoping, we have a lot of things in motion now to keep the progress going.
I say take that trophy and run with it. Take that heavyweight champion belt and run with it. I do want to do a quick time check. I know we have another panel.
Time for a couple more questions.
Okay, perfect. And if you don't mind, I just want to make sure, because Sherry is listening intently, and I know that Centara is doing quite a bit. Did you have any comments that you want to add, any thoughts that have come up for you? Okay, terrific. All right, so you're next. Okay.
So my BFF is the Director of Community Outreach with Optima. We share a lot of projects, investments. It is philanthropy and grant funded for some. I will say we are working very closely with the state and the continuum of care, the community service boards, to develop a proof of concept so that down the line, as Medicaid expansion continues to evolve, there are opportunities to have a sustainability model through reimbursement. So I won't comment on exactly what Optima does and doesn't cover. However, they are deep in the weeds of social determinants and partnering with myself and the rest of the health system on comprehensive, holistic approach to breaking down the social determinants. And that goes all the way into the work, GED, a number of other things that we would consider social determinants. So, great question.
Okay, yeah, and that's great that we have Anthem and not directly, United Healthcare is part of our continuum of care. And so I just would love to touch base with you on that as well. Because we do cover all the way through the Carolina border, and it's going to be a lot of optimal things.
That's great. You know, I would welcome the connection because, like I said, what I oftentimes feel like there are resources available. There's just a lack of a touch point. So that would be great.
There was another question. You raised your hand.
Two quick questions. And first, as far as the broadband, can you take into account the households where the school is providing, I think they call it Wi-Fi, or we find that a lot of our clients are using their kids' computers that the school has provided for them for things that they're doing too, like meetings and things like that. I don't know that that should be happening, but it is access. So I was curious about that. And then my question for you, sorry,
Sherry.
As far as telehealth and households where there are, several family members, like a very larger household, what do you do about confidentiality, especially in counseling and the type of services that are provided? They're all, and if there are a lot of people, like even my best friend came over because her son was getting counseling services and he asked her to leave. And it was telehealth because he didn't trust that she would be listening to the session. You know what I mean? So how do you all take that into account?
No, you go ahead.
So confidentiality is a huge issue, obviously somewhat out of our control in the home setting. I had a similar situation where we're all managing elderly parents or adult children who do access such services as behavioral health. I think that the individual receiving those services obviously has the most control over that scenario. I don't do the telehealth management and monitoring. I've been a recipient of that during the pandemic, and so it really comes down to the providers being diligent about asking, are you in a safe place? Can you have this conversation? And or, do we need to reschedule? And I've had physicians reschedule for a family member because she, wasn't in a place where she wanted to take that phone call. So.
Yeah, and to your question about MiFis or hotspots, we don't consider that bona fide broadband. Just like we don't consider your cell phone broadband, because there are data limits to it. They might throttle your speed when you hit a certain data limit. So for that reason, we've never considered that broadband. With that said, when Governor Northam allocated $30 million to broadband from the CARES Act in 2020, we had to get that money out the door quickly. And we funded some projects to buy these hotspots, these cellular hotspots for students who are unserved. Because we recognize, look, they're learning from home now. They need this. Even though it's not bona fide broadband, it'll still provide them some connectivity to kind of bridge it for we call it Band-Aid solutions. So we kind of put it in the same bucket as like public Wi-Fi hotspots. So we also funded a lot of those, like schools and firehouses and community centers. We paid for their new equipment to project Wi-Fi into the parking lot, which is great if you don't have anything, but it's a Band-Aid solution. It's not a long-term solution.
So, awesome. So we are coming to a close. I would love to give our panelists, Sherry and Kyle, an opportunity to give closing thoughts, share any resources, events, or grant deadlines that are coming up. And I also want to say thank you for being an incredible audience, very engaged. It's really hard to do the moderation because you want to keep everybody excited and keep us moving along. So thank you for your participation. Which of you would like to provide closing
Yeah, I
thoughts?
just want to shout out Tiffany for being a great moderator, and thank you, Jonathan, and the Housing Forward for inviting me. The only thing I'll plug is our website, commonwealthconnect.virginia.gov. That's a kind of a one-stop shop to find everything you need to know about what we're doing in Virginia and kind of stay up to date about what's happening in Virginia. But it's been an honor to be here today.
And I would just say thank you to all of you in the room. There is a huge connection. I could go on for hours about the housing component of health. So if you reach out to, and I've been talking to healthcare systems all across the nation about what their investments are going into, and it really is exploring this housing component and how we all work together. I would say the pandemic has allowed us to move very quickly down that path. So the time is now to look for your $1 million checks. You know, start working and forming relationships with foundations, health foundations and hospitals, because the opportunity for us to partner together and the ROI for the patient, the individual, and their family is huge. It's more than a voucher. It's more than a one-time visit. It's more than a broadband bill. The ROI on reducing chronic disease and meeting people where they are in their homes around their behavioral health crisis and preventing suicide and preventing trauma is huge. So if you don't think that what you're doing is making a difference, you're terribly wrong. We all make a difference, and this component is important to all of us. So thank you for being here today.
Awesome. So we look forward to you all being ambassadors of digitally inclusive, affordable housing in the state of Virginia on your properties specifically. And I invite you to check out the Richmond Fed's website. We have quite a bit of information around broadband access. We're looking at workforce housing and several other issues. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, Kyle. And thank you, Sherry. So while that panel's coming down, I'll invite Vaughn, Jovan, and Jennifer, our final panel, to come up to the stage. I know these folks are just getting off the road, so thank them when they're done for getting here to be a part of this. It's kind of strange to deal with driving to conferences and being physically somewhere. I feel like I'm still kind of rusty with my logistics, but something that's come up in every panel so far is local governments, local and regional governments. And I think these three folks coming up here will provide some really excellent perspective on what is working in the Commonwealth. Both Jennifer and Jovan represent regions that have really terrific blueprints for affordable housing that have been created over the past few years, and I hope and expect that they will tell you about them and tell you about their lessons. But now that they are seated and ready to go, I'm going to turn it over to Vaughn Poller, our board chair for Housing Forward, who will get us started.
Good afternoon, everyone. Batting clean up here today. I am Vaughn Poller. I am the Neighborhood Development Administrator for James City County, so I had the shortest commute of anybody up here today. I'd like for my co-panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Jennifer Wilsey. Wilsey.
Sure, yes. Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Wilsey, and I'm a planner with the New River Valley Regional Commission. And so we're in Southwest Virginia in the Montgomery, Blacksburg, Radford area.
Jovan, go ahead.
So Jovan Burton with the Partnership for Housing Affordability. So we're basically serving the Richmond region, the greater Richmond region, suburban and urban localities there. And we essentially help our local governments understand what their housing needs are and how they can address them through policy.
So this conversation is a generative one coming from the perspective of local governments. So starting out, just pre-COVID, what were the housing policy trends or policies in your local area that you were concerned about? Your local communities?
So I'll say for the Richmond region, there was a lot of momentum, quite a bit of momentum actually, that was happening on a regional level. A big part of that was our suburban localities, particularly Henrico and Chesterfield, had recently established a Department of Community Enhancement in the case of Chesterfield, and Henrico had bolstered its Department of Community Revitalization. And they'd really shifted a lot of their federal funding towards the development of actual affordable housing rather than just services. And so we were starting to see those trends, and then in the city, we were beginning to see greater allocations for their Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So all signs pointed to the trends being greater investments at the local level to address housing and this issue becoming more of a public policy priority. So those were the big trends in addition to zoning, but I think we expected more on the financial side, some of those trends to continue prior to COVID, and we'll obviously get to that. But
and I might have something a little bit similar where I feel like pre-COVID we were in our region starting to see a trend of just really heightened housing demand. We have 2 universities in our region, and so that plays a large role in an otherwise rural area. I'm going to have my more rural hat on than the Richmond area, but because of that university influence, we see a really high amount of demand, and not necessarily the types of price escalation, but just the lack of inventory. And so we're starting to get into that price escalation point for those across the whole spectrum, really. And some of what we are privy to is having started a regional housing study in 2018 and trying to finish it up in 2020 during the pandemic, and just seeing, which I guess we'll get to in a second, seeing some of those trends starting to just escalate and be exacerbated by the pandemic.
One thing I want to point out about geography here is that Javon's representing what I would say is a more urban locality, while Jennifer's more rural. I'm coming from a suburban locality. We're actually trapped between, or located between Richmond and Norfolk. And so we're basically a bedroom locality to both those communities. And what we were dealing with it was similar to what they were talking about. We consistently see through demand, we are one of the faster growing localities in the Commonwealth. So we see pressure on our housing stock and need for more affordable housing. Most of the growth in our communities was with market rate. And we have a number of gated communities. And so we have, of our changing demographic, we have more retirees moving in, and they come with their retirement income and are driving up the cost of housing. So playing off of that, how has the pandemic stalled or changed or amplified those policy trends?
So I'll say, similar to you all, we were actually in the process of creating kind of a regional housing guide. We call it the Regional Housing Framework for our region. And we launched that in January of 2020 with the idea that we had a bevy of solutions for localities to pick from and to decide what would be their priorities. And then a few months later, we had to really shift. But the beauty of that document is that, one, we designed it to be a living document, and two, we designed it to be such that we could adjust pretty quickly despite the fact that COVID was occurring. So we knew we weren't going to approach any of our local governments asking for big budgetary decisions, but rather we could shift to focus on zoning and also crisis response. So I'll say to your question, whether things stalled, changed, or amplified, it was probably all three. Stalled on the financial investment side, but it shifted in terms of crisis response, because a lot of our local governments went to figuring out how they can distribute a lot of the federal dollars that they were getting. And then we decided, well, we have a big need in our region. There's a lot of resources. How do you know the eligibility status if you're someone who's in need of these sources? How do you know where to go, who still has funding, et cetera? So we created a resource that is regional and it's phone-based, whereby folks who are in need of housing, who are dealing with housing instability, can get connected with these resources efficiently. And it's something that has serviced over almost 9,000 residents so far. So we started that in September of 2020, and that's called the Housing Resource Line. But this really serves as a phone-based access point for all of our regions. And what's critical about that is it really unearthed the severity of the housing needs that we have in our region. We get real-time data now directly from the residents, and we were seeing exactly how they were being impacted by the pandemic. About 50% of the callers indicated their housing needs had been impacted by COVID-19, and furthermore, just demonstrating the connection between health and housing, almost 60% of the callers indicated that they have either a long-term chronic health issue or some form of disability. So just giving you an idea of the situations that a lot of folks who are dealing with housing instability are living with. When school started last year, we started to hear a lot of calls coming in from faculty from school and teachers and others who are finally seeing the environments that their students are learning in, especially because it was virtual learning. So when you have children who are living in their car, or they're in their car because where they're living, in terms of mold, it's just not safe for them to be learning. And so we get a lot of calls from guidance counselors and teachers concerned what resources are out there for these folks. So I think through the shift and through crisis response, we've been able to better understand what our needs are, and that helps us better inform our policy decisions moving forward. So I do think that's one of the silver linings, if you will, from the pandemic, is that now we can use that real-time data and approach our local governments and say, now we know what's in the highest demand. The biggest need is very clearly, people need rental options. Our hotels and motels have essentially become de facto housing and permanent supportive housing. And so that's a big problem. Overburdens our homeless services system, and the exits from homelessness are quite clogged. And so until we can free that up, we're going to continue to have issues. But I think it's really to put into perspective how grave a lot of the supply and demand issues are that we have in the region.
Jennifer?
I feel like the pandemic, again, just sort of exacerbated the things that we were already seeing. And I guess on the plus side, because we had started the work on our housing study, we knew we had buy-in from our communities around the importance of housing, and then I think we got to really put an exclamation point on the end of that as a couple different things were happening. So with us being rural, obviously it goes without saying, I think everybody financially on the fringes in communities, if they were on the margin, then the COVID insecurity with jobs or layoffs made that even worse. And so it really rose to the forefront that folks were in need of affordable housing. But on the market side of things for us, I think we were also seeing how we as a rural, in some areas, very connected community also became a highlight for people leaving larger cities because they could work remotely, because they decided that they, things in a more urban area were less secure, they could come to our community. And so, again, our demand for housing across the spectrum really got pushed even harder. And so we were then trying to finish the plan, and everybody was knowing how important some of this data was. And so, getting knocks on the door, is the study done yet? Is the study done yet? To be able to get their hands on some of the data that we were working on. All that to say, I think it also pinpointed some of the connections that housing has to public health, to education, to broadband. I know some personal stories of folks who were either looking for housing or building a home during that time, and their priorities changed. I think maybe where we were seeing some decreases in square footage, people liking that downsized lifestyle, everyone's now ramping up and saying, how can I make sure that my home is suitable to work from home separately from perhaps a partner or a spouse, or to homeschool my children? Do we have the connectivity that we need for streaming and online school and Zoom meetings and all of those things? And the connection with housing on that was obviously very clear, because people were so home-based that all of that came into strong focus. And so I guess as we talk in next steps about what to do with that, I'm hoping that some of the folks in our region were really able to see the need for housing even more so than they did when they were asking for the study, to make sure that we had enough housing stock. It just really came into strong focus that we had a lot of work to do. And I think there were some partnerships that, that came out of that, not always specific to housing, but always with a connection that we could make back as to, are we providing the quality residence, availability, connectivity, near amenities and services for our full-time residents.
Let me see a show of hands. How many of you all here work for a local government, city or county or township? Okay, so the minority of the people here, which is interesting because I think part of what is missed by people outside of local government is understanding some of the timing and some of the uniqueness of this particular, I mean, everyone had to scramble and turn on a dime. Localities aren't used to doing things very quickly. And so I think one of the things, there was a lot of learning going on and a lot of OJT, which I think for the most part, from my perspective, the localities in the Commonwealth did a pretty good job. The other thing I would want to point out is the commonality that you're hearing. We work for localities, but we are also in that housing part of the locality, so we sit in those localities with a housing mind. And so I'm thinking about those common things that we're hearing. One is that we all understand that there's a need for housing, and I think where that intersects with the localities are those entities who govern and determine from their zoning and land use how and where and how much of that housing will sit on the ground. I will tell you, as an administrator within local government, one of the harder things is to convey to the policymakers the need to help them see it. And I do think one of the things, hearing Javon talk about having that real-time data, that I think is a godsend. And so I think for you all who are providers of services but have that data and can push it towards your localities, I encourage you to do so, because I think there's a great opportunity now, because we're in this flux of changes where everyone's having to step back and look at their systems and ask themselves, is this structure still serving us the best way it could? And then how do we need to determine and change it for it to serve us better? You all have that data, so I want to invite you all where you are to think about how you can inject your data and your thinking and what you're seeing into those systems. Jennifer talked about them doing the housing study. That's a huge thing. We completed one in 2016, and then we used that to start a workforce housing task force. Having that data inform that task force, and having that task force, which was made up of local citizens, to inform our elected officials is also key. Someone earlier was talking about how influential realtors are to elected officials. That's not been my observation, but voters are really influential to elected officials. And where you can have those voters understand what's going on in housing. Often, housers, we get so caught up into what we're doing in the day-to-day, we sometimes may think that everybody understands what we're doing, and that's not true. Most people stand on the outside and look at housing and scratch their heads. They look at development, and they saw it or read it in the news or saw it on the evening news, and they expect that those apartments, that complex, that neighborhood is going to be out of the ground and people living there next month, and that's just not how it happens. And so where you can help people understand what the processes are and get them involved in those processes early on, it would be a great help, I think. Because I do think where the rubber's going to meet the road is a conversation Commonwealth-wide about our land use. Picking back up on the questions of the day, how have housing needs in your region changed since 2020?
So I think the biggest thing probably is realizing, and I didn't think this was really possible, but just how constrained our supply was, and that it's even worse on the rental side. And I think a big part of that is we realized the extent to which our housing market really relied on evictions, quite frankly. And so in combination with a housing market on the homeownership side that was moving very quickly, and you have situations where some owners look at the market and say, well, I think it's a good opportunity to sell. And so folks who are renting those single family homes are then left with, a certain number of days to find rental housing that's just not there. And that creates the situation that you have where you have many folks resorting to living in hotels or motels and paying far more to stay there than you would at an apartment complex. Or there being additional barriers to some of those rental housing because of either them losing their job with COVID or getting evicted before some of the protections were put in place. And so you're just kind of in this perpetual cycle of very difficult to access housing in an extremely competitive market. It's extremely difficult for many of those folks who are coming out of homeless services to access that housing because they're not nearly as competitive as some other renters. And so I think a lot of our service providers found out the links that they have to go through in order just to get one family housed, and whether that's providing bonuses and paying any arrears and covering first month's rent, second month's rent, just to get someone housed and make them competitive. And that's just not sustainable, obviously, when federal dollars begin to wane. And so I think what we're seeing is that we obviously have a deficit of homes before the pandemic. It was about 20,000 units that we were at a deficit at prior to the pandemic. We're adding 29,000 new low-income households in our region between now and 2040. So when you think about that, and then the rate at which we're building, which is not anywhere near where we need to, we have a lot of challenges. And within that, you have a senior population that's rapidly growing. What do you do with individuals that are no longer able to fiscally or physically maintain their homes, but there aren't many senior options for them to move into on the rental side, and certainly not affordable ones on the home ownership side to downsize into. So I think it's all across the board, but certainly our supply continues to be the biggest determinant of what opportunities exist or do not exist within our region.
Jennifer.
I think we're seeing a lot of those same things. The only thing I would probably add that is unique to us is the pressure on the rental side of our university towns. The vast majority of our available rental units in the region are in our university towns, and they cater to students, and not just students, but to the parents of students paying those prices. So both the availability, the rental cycle, almost all of our rental cycle is that July to June. If you come in December, you are sort of scrapping for a rental unit. Many of them are high-end apartments rented by the bedroom, just everything that caters to a student population. And so even anecdotally, hearing of colleagues or coworkers who come to the region with a new job, they are having to do some major detective work to find rental, and it's not that it would be even easier to buy either. So we're seeing that. We're seeing the needs for aging in place, folks not wanting to move, and then just the sheer lack of inventory means by and large, unless somebody is selling to leave the region, selling to move about the region is very difficult. Contingencies are non-existent. Cash offers with all manner of inspections waived, escalation clauses, all those things are very much the norm right now. We do have some development happening, mostly at market rate, mostly at some pretty high entry prices. And so again, it's sort of blocking out some of our moderate, not even necessarily workforce housing, 80% below of area median income, but just folks who want a $250,000 house. Those are almost non-existent or very, very competitive to come by. And so we're just seeing all of that escalate. I think we're also seeing some of the extra pressure happening in our employment centers, where just the added cost of land prices playing into high home prices in general. And so as a region, and then the local governments in some of those areas are really trying to start cracking that nut of realizing it cannot just be a private sector ball game, that we have to get involved with some creative ways to get housing prices and land prices down, and exploring a regional housing trust fund in the future, and a couple of our employment centers where pressure is the highest are also looking into community land trust, so we can take out that high escalation cost of the land in order to try to get some of these homeownership opportunities for our more moderate income folks. So just really acknowledging that we do not have enough units on the ground for the people who want to live in our region, and how to do that through some development for sure, creative housing options, not just looking at single family detached, looking at smaller footprints, looking at the dreaded D word of density, and ways in which that we can be creative of getting people to have housing opportunities in the region.
Thank you. Certainly I think today in this session we've heard some themes that have been bubbling up, and I suspect that you're going to hear throughout this conference hear those same things. One is that we don't have enough units, that we've got people, we just don't have enough units. Certainly it's a simple supply and demand. If we had more supply, the demand would decrease. And I think for some reasons that we're not entirely certain as to why we seem to be seeing an acceleration of cost. Certainly in our news, in our day-to-day news, we're hearing talk of inflation. I think from the housing side, I think we've been noticing that for quite some time. I don't see any loosening of constraints in the near term. The other thing that I'm hearing is that a missing middle. We tend to live in these areas where we built a particular type of housing, and primarily it was single-family detached, and so there's not enough of that other middle housing, which are the duplexes, triplexes, and quads, and so on. You're in a locality, Norfolk, which has a very rich housing stock with multiple types of, quadruplexes, small 8-unit apartments, and so on. And I think maybe we look at this, look at the city of Norfolk and try to do some takeaways from there, because I do think density is something that a lot of people say and then spit because it's such a bad word. And so I think it's hard to have that conversation without people going to their corners, but I think it's one we're definitely going to have to engage with. Jennifer, you started to touch on different ways of pivoting, and I think Javon, you did too, but can you all discuss more about how you're seeing localities having to work together, give some examples, and then what are you thinking about carrying those examples of working together in a more partnership or regional partnership moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've obviously talked at length about the needs and how severe they are, but I think I don't want to understate a lot of the great work that is happening in the region, and particularly at the local government level, all the things that they are doing in order to combat some of the challenges that we have. And so I think you mentioned creativity. A lot of what our localities are beginning to do is looking at a lot of their strip mall centers and shopping centers that are aging, and what are the opportunities there, and how does housing play a role into that. In particular, Chesterfield County did an internal study looking at how many aging shopping centers they have, and they found that they had about 63 that were over the age of 25, and many of them have enormous surface parking lots that were built for the day after Thanksgiving, and that was at the beginning of the pandemic when they completed that study, so I think there was a lot of kind of encouragement about, hey, there's some opportunity here for us as a county to maybe pursue purchase of these centers. And look at future land use and how housing can play a role, because if you look at the jobs and housing imbalance that we have in our region, this would be a great opportunity to mitigate that, and also to have it connected with amenities and transportation. And so we actually ended up doing a study through Chesterfield County to look at that issue a little bit further and figure out what centers in particular would be prime for redevelopment, partial or full redevelopment, and what are the existing zoning barriers, so that the county and their planning commission could look at some of those barriers and figure out, okay, here are some areas where maybe we can designate them as local revitalization or conservation areas, and now they would be eligible to receive some of the incentives we have for housing development. What are the density regulations for these centers and where they're located, and what are they zoned for? So it allows them to zero in and see, and that was also accompanied by a financial model where they can kind of understand what the cash flows of some of those centers, so they can get an idea which ones would be more likely to sell moving forward. So I think we're seeing that shopping center redevelopment occur more and more in our region. Henrico County's begun to do some redevelopment of some of its shopping centers, and the trend is really to have mixed use and housing as a component of that redevelopment, and with the idea that hopefully we can have some affordability baked into some of that future redevelopment.
How are you anchoring the affordability in your redevelopment?
So that's a great question. I'll just speak to Chesterfield County. There were two centers in particular that we looked at, one of which would be for full redevelopment and one for partial redevelopment. And so kind of in the aftermath of that, or really at the same time, the county put together an affordable housing task force that had members of its planning commission there to talk about, okay, what can the planning commission and the board of supervisors actually be presented with that are palatable, that we can begin to make progress on and understand, what incentives are at our disposal. So they've begun looking at, some of the low-hanging fruits that we have from a legislative standpoint, whether it's, voluntary incentives with an affordable dwelling unit ordinance, some of the zoning overlays that they've done throughout the county along the Jefferson-Davis corridor, in which you can do multifamily by right where you previously could not. They've already done the market studies to just understand kind of what that market can absorb from an affordability standpoint or from a unit standpoint. And so those are the steps that have been taken so far, and I think we'll continue to see that, hopefully. But I think the counties are beginning to realize the different types of incentives that they do have, that they can also better understand their role. It's not as if their role is to completely solve these challenges, but to create an environment in which this type of development is more conducive, I think, is ultimately what we're trying to get them to understand.
Okay. Jennifer?
Yes, so I think we've I guess before I get into some development things, something that had come to my mind, and you had mentioned the like a resource call center, and at the end of last year, I guess, we had an existing in the region housing resource guide, which tackled both affordable rental that was available in the region, as well as some supportive services that usually go hand in hand with that. And that was something that had been in existence in the region for a couple of years, but came to the forefront as more and more of our localities and service agencies were getting call after call asking, where can I find housing, where can I find rental assistance, where can I find help for this? And so we actually had most of our member localities, which is 5 localities, chip in a little bit of the CARES funding that they had at the end of last year. And we did a more robust overhaul of that. And we actually took that opportunity to also partner with Virginia Housing. They have a housing search website that sort of catalogs all of the rental housing that is income-based in the region. And so we were able to put that together in a comprehensive way so that as we were receiving and our partners were receiving these calls looking for assistance, that we could push them towards that. And so that's a partnership that technically was existing, but I think everybody saw a greater need to make sure that that resource was up to date. So we weren't taking, live calls, but we were able to give them a solid resource for some of those needs, because we saw an uptick in that for sure towards the middle to end of last year. On the development side, talking about how our regional partnerships and things like that can get involved. So the New River Valley is using, taking the opportunity off the heels of our housing study. That almost coincided perfectly with Virginia Housing's release of their $1, $2, and $3 million grant monies for planning district commissions statewide. And so we, I think like every other PDC, took advantage of that, but we were able to go right back to our regional strategies that we had just spent a year and a half creating and said, what is going to give us, the most impact? And, 2 of the things that rose to the top we're looking at a regional housing trust fund, which is somewhat unique for the state of Virginia. Most of them are either locality or county-town partnerships, but we're trying to go for a regional approach, mostly because as a rural area, it sort of takes all of us to have the impact that we sort of need. But the other piece that we hope to go alongside of that, which I think every affordable housing provider, or if you touch affordable housing at all, is focusing on a public education and outreach component. It seemed like everybody wanted to go back to that as a ground zero for we cannot get people on board with some of the creative things that we want to do if they don't understand what we're trying to do, or if they have a misconception of what it could look like or who it's for. And so a lot of our folks, local government and on the nonprofit side, said we would love for everyone to sort of be on the same page. What does affordable mean? What does workforce housing mean? What does low income mean? How is that the same or different from Section 8 housing? And do we really need more of it? That whole thing that everyone, I'm preaching to the choir here, I'm sure. But letting that go hand in hand, because some of the folks that we're going to be reaching out to for the Housing Trust Fund are not just our local governments who, granted, still need education. Elected officials always need the extra education, as do their constituents. But we wanted to be able to reach out to our healthcare providers, our hospitals and health institutions, to the universities that are in our backyard, and say, if you really do believe that housing is an issue like we have seen that it is, how about you join this process, put some money in, put some influence in, so that we can have an extra pot of funds to be able to make our housing dollars go forward. And that could be, public or private funds, and have a little bit of control and creativity with a regionally administrative or regionally controlled set of funds. And so we are at the very beginning of that, and it's going to be a lot of work, I think, but I'm hoping that we have a really big reward in the next couple of years to educate our groups and get them on board with this in a time where it is so evident. So if we can't get them on board now, then either we are way missing the mark, or we never will, because I think everyone, from whatever their purview is seeing how housing is important. And so we just want to capitalize on that to be able to move the region forward.
Thank you. So I want to open it up now because we're about at time. So officials, people who represent local government, you guys are citizens. What would you have, or what insights do you have that you'd like to see local governments start initiating with respect to providing affordability? Go ahead.
I'm a municipality, so do you mind if I ask a question?
Please.
If you want to go to them first.
No.
I'm going to ask the speaker realtor about that. I used to be a realtor, and I was in charge of RFAC for my area, so that's why I thought that.
No worries.
That's not a thing. So, Sherry, do you have your...
Jennifer.
Jennifer, I'm sorry.
Moving on, next.
So sorry. Do you have your public housing education outreach program underway now? Does it exist?
Not yet. No, we are about to submit sort of an extra grant application to be able to put that in motion. We have the framework for it because it was one of our beautiful regional strategies. So we've got a great game plan, and we're looking by probably the turn of the year to get that underway so that it aligns with the extra work that we're doing with the trust fund.
Okay, so I have in the greater region, we have a large, well, although we do have some urban, suburban, we have a large, also agricultural area, and so I have a similar project that's in our strategic plan with cash, and I've been reaching out to housing navigators about doing a similar program, what you're talking about for outreach to landlords, I can help you do my launch that was hopefully going to be the first of the year as well, so our timelines run pretty parallel. So I'd love to have some partnership there.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I'm knowing that I want to do is making it incredibly visual, interactive. We're probably going to head to a lot of short videos that can either be done in little blips or pieced together for a longer message, and then we can be, share those out with partners who can then share them on their channels. So we're just trying to make it very relatable, very, using our current technology, what all the young kids, the hip kids are doing.
Carmen?
So the shopping center report is certainly available on our website, pharva.com, and that'll be available in its entirety. The data from the call center, that's an ongoing program that we operate, so you can certainly give my email, and if there's any data points that you want, we can pull. Yep.
Yes.
And I know we're short for time, but I think it's important that I ask this question and you guys kind of elaborate on it, because this whole, I don't know how long we've been here, 2 or 3 hours, and we're talking a lot
Seems
about
longer.
affordable housing and building affordable housing, and you guys have done your studies and all, and you mentioned Chesterfield, but I'm never talking about Chesterfield, because I got thoughts about that, but what did you find in your study around the racial inequities around housing? Because even if we're building housing, I mean, Richmond is building housing all over the place. So that's not an issue, there in that scheme of things. It's lofts here, it's beautiful $1,200, $1,400 units everywhere, right? So what are the housing that's needed for the people that live in the region that are being pushed out, right? Pushed out of the city. What did you find in your studies, around that, being that Virginia itself was built on, our communities were built on redlining, post-state, we know the history about it. What did you find in your study that you could bring forward to, that data to legislation, to make changes for the state,
Right.
And for Jennifer, and just particularly in the rural area, what does that look like? What does I know it may be less minorities, people of color, that kind of stuff, but then you have people that are now refugees coming in, and we have a lot of different diverse people. So can you talk a little bit, not to take up a lot of everybody's time, but can you talk about that in your studies? I just didn't get a lot of that during this session. So I feel like it's very, very important.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a session on its own, based on what we found. I mean, and it's a lot of it's no surprise. I mean, if you look at on the homeownership side of what we found as far as some of the racial disparities, particularly the homeownership rate for our region was about 47%, which was lower than it was in 1970. So that decreased mostly in the city of Richmond, where for black homeownership it was down 6% from 2000, from the year 2000 at least. So that's happening most acutely in a few neighborhoods, and is kind of a continuing trend. So that was very evident. There was no way around that, and that was baked into a lot of the different areas in our study. On the rental side, we found that obviously the greatest need is at below 30% of the area median income. There's no secret about that, and that's also what's not getting built. So as you mentioned, there's quite a bit of development happening throughout the region. How much of it is for the folks that we're talking about? Not that much, particularly when you look at the senior issue and folks who are on fixed incomes and the lack of options that they have. That's also very apparent. So I think the racial disparities were very clear and along the lines of renting and home ownership throughout our region, not just within the city. That was something that we wanted to emphasize. The demographics show that poverty, for the large part, has been traveling to the suburbs in the last 15 to 20 years. And so that's something that I think our counties in particular are having to face with more and more and more, and what are the implications for housing? Having to, I think you mentioned it, have more than just single family, and having different housing types that are accepted, and also that are within our major corridors, and they're accessible, they're not isolated, which is previously what had been happening in terms of zoning, of having only multifamily sites and areas in which it had to be pretty isolated in terms of the acreage that it had to sit on. So what that does for folks in terms of how long you're traveling to jobs, what access you have to transportation, there's not much transportation the further you get away from the city. So all of that certainly came up within our studies, and we're going to actually do a refresh of the data next year to see kind of what's changed in the last 3 years. Are things getting worse in some areas? Are things getting better? And so I think we'll continue to be able to feed that information to our local governments so that there's really no hiding around what the issue is. I think it's very evident, particularly at the 30% AMI.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add. So the New River Valley is very white, to the point where I think we did attempt to look at cost burden ratios by race to compare that with the region as a whole. And as far as reliable, objective data, we don't have an exact number, but I think we found that the range is anywhere from being exactly on par with the rest of the region as far as being cost burdened, spending more than 30% of your income towards housing, all the way up to, which was around the 24% mark, all the way up to about 47%. So if you're looking at it as a margin of error, somewhere in the middle is probably the most accurate, which would then be disproportionately higher than the rest of the region. Otherwise, it's really hard for us to get reliable census-based data at the race level.
Yes, go ahead.
What are the efforts that are happening with you guys? What are the efforts between VAGHC and just like the transit folks in trying to convince the county to increase the amount of transit that can come from the city to
GRTC, you mean?
So.
Not necessarily GRTC?
Okay. I'm talking about, the folks, the advocates, like RVA, Rapid Transit, like the people who kind of get why it's important and why we should manage transportation to housing. Like what things are y'all doing together with your data to, enforce that importance of marrying those two things together?
Yeah, I mean, that was something that was evident within our study and something that was discussed kind of at length in certain sections, but that hasn't been a big focus because of just the policy zoning and other things that have been going on. We did actually have, speaking of GRTC, and kind of the closest conversations we had around transit, we had them come and talk to our board back in May. In particular, since they're doing kind of a long-range transportation plan for our region, we wanted to get their thoughts on how does housing play a role into that. What are your plans to account for housing? And in particular, what do our nonprofit developers and other developers who are building housing need to know about these plans? Where you're going to be expanding transit at so that they can coordinate their pipeline in the future with where their transportation plans will be. So that's the extent of the conversations we've had.
So I just asked that question because I realized just through all my involvement of like the county realizing how much they need help with housing and that transition of poverty into the county. And I think having some type of strategic approach of just showing them like what are going to be the counter effects of them not engaging in the episode, needed conversation of like why don't we get less into your area would just be really
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think you're going to see that more and more. The county has expanded it, at least in Chesterfield. It's expanded it south, but I think it's kind of a one-way. Yeah.
So
slowly but surely.
Jonathan has stood up and given me the sign. But Tiffany had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tiffany.
It was more of a question and a comment. I thought it was really interesting to hear perspectives from suburbia, urban, and rural. And it's interesting because I work in a predominantly rural area, but the issues are starting to conflate.
Yeah.
I mean, when Javon made the comment around, the issues with isolated development, people not having access to transit, and you expanded upon that question. And then Jennifer, when you talk about density issues and student housing and the market being driven, how are we having these conversations across different geographies? Because Virginia is one of the most geographically diverse states I've ever worked in. And we've been talking about sort of this great rural-urban divide and zero-sum game, and we're kind of all sitting in the same boat now. So I'm really curious what that looked like for you all when preparing for the panel.
So what I would say is that we need to be cautious because the solution is probably given those geographic differences. One of the things I'm curious to see is what type of pressures bringing broadband into those rural areas it was going to have. Because now it is going to be, I think as Jennifer was saying, people will be even more comfortable with leaving the more densely populated urban areas to go seek Shangri-La out in the rural areas. But what you'll find is that in the rural areas, it's rural for a reason. There are cows out there, and there's no Starbucks nearby. And so I think that's going to be interesting. Then I wonder if part of what we're dealing with is the reason we have this constraint is that there's not enough trickle-down housing. In normal, healthy operating housing stocks, you have trickle-down housing. And so because we've artificially constrained what we build, mostly because I think Virginia is the larger magnification of what my county dealt with. My county was very rural up until the 70s, and then it incurred a building boom that echoed in each subsequent 10-year period. So we tend to have a monolithic housing stock with no trickle down. And so that, and people being people, they're gonna go somewhere. And that's why our affordable housing stock is basically called a hotel that's no longer serving the market. And you can see that across all regions too. So yeah, I think we can identify the challenges. The solutions though are not as evident because I believe the solutions are more structural within our policies at the elected level. It's land use. And then the other part is financing, getting the finance to match the need. Correct. And the last 20 months really showed how much we don't know. Anything else to add up here?
Cede to Jonathan.
I would love to stay in this room and talk with everybody for the rest of the night and just have food delivered here and we'll all just hang out. But they do need this room for other things. I need to let the wonderful AV folks go and do their thing. Let all of you go to your hotel rooms. The keynote is very soon, so I hope you all get a chance to see that and all the other great stuff planned for today in the next few days. I want to thank everybody who came here, who attended, sat in here, and is still here right now. I want to thank everybody who is still streaming online and watching this in your PJs, and thank everybody, all of our speakers and moderators who came in. I think at the very least, we have 100 new ideas for sessions in the future. So we are set. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your conference.